I think what we need now is a new landmark act of Parliament to set the vision for the coming 50 to 100 years. Truly visionary in restoring nature at scale, but doing that in a way which is going to help the country to thrive in terms of public health, our resilience to climate change, and to be able to secure our water and food security long into the future.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm very happy to have my friend Tony Juniper here. Tony's chair of Natural England, which makes him possibly the most important person in the nature restoration story, at least in England, if not beyond. Tony, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Absolute pleasure, Ben. So nice to see you.
The first thing I've been excited to tell you is that we've got nightjars at Canwood.
Oh, amazing.
We've never spotted nightjars here. The place has been surveyed for quite a long time. There's no record of nightjars here any time in recent decades. And the woods around us, since we clear-felled the conifer, are absolutely filled with that strange sound of nightjars now.
That's absolutely fantastic. I hear they're having a good year this year in England, which is hugely encouraging, especially for these long-distant migrants that face all of these challenges en route between their nesting grounds and wintering grounds. So to see them doing well is absolutely fantastic.
And where do nightjars go?
Sub-Saharan Africa. So they cross the Sahara Desert. And they do that trip twice a year, of course. And like all other migrants, a series of challenges that increasingly face those birds that go such long distances in terms of habitat loss en route. Obviously, the impacts of climate change, the spread of the desert, making the journey without water and food longer for some parts of their migration. So the birds that we see here every spring and summer, which come to breed, their story is really quite a complicated one in terms of their conservation, because there's a lot going on beyond their departure from here.
And that's true not just of nightjars, but chiffchaffs and a whole bunch of different warblers and hobbies and other hawks and all kinds of species, nightingales, turtle doves. And a lot of them are getting hammered by hunters. I went to Malta in March. I'd never been before. It's an absolutely beautiful island. I went for the launch of the new Malta Environment Foundation. And overwhelmingly the biggest nature issue, as far as I can make out, the 30,000, unfettered, uncontrolled hunters, with guns who are shooting all these migrating birds. So, one of the conservationists there told me that these little birds, little passerines and things, are so exhausted that they literally drop out of the sky onto that rock in the middle of the Mediterranean to rest before picking themselves up, feeding and going off in the subsequent days up into Europe. And across Malta and in other parts of the Mediterranean, they're getting shot. So how big an issue is that for kind of nightjars and other migrating birds?
Well, it's significant, and it depends on the species. Some are more targeted than others. One thing I did notice last year in Cambridgeshire, where I live, was a noticeable increase in the turtle dove population. And for the first time in many years, I saw 5 at once just outside the city in an area of beautiful grassy scrub. And that increase in the turtle dove population here, which I saw was recorded across the country, was at the same time as there was a hunting ban in parts of Europe under EU rules. And so, you do see a relationship between hunting pressure and the populations of some of these birds, which have suffered really quite catastrophic declines during recent years. And the turtle dove is now at a tiny remnant of what it was even 30 years ago. And so this is a material factor a lot on top of all of the others. And, whenever you look at the fortunes of different animals, usually it's the case that there is a combination of factors involved, either in their decline or their increase. And for the turtle dove, changes to agriculture inevitably have had an impact in terms of the availability of the seeds that they need to eat. The loss of nesting habitat, scrub now in England is a habitat which we have far too little of. And then, of course, hunting, which for a bird like that, when it's down to low numbers, is going to take a particular toll when they're already so depleted. So hunting is not something which is without its effects, really, especially on populations that have already been reduced by other factors.
Yeah, it seems to me that our flyway, the East Atlantic flyway, which represents some migratory birds coming up from Africa, up through Western Europe, Britain and many of them up beyond into the Arctic. It's one of the most important migratory bird flyways in the world. We ought to have some kind of a treaty in which countries along the whole flyway cooperate in order to protect habitat and protect these species when they're traveling. I think there's been sort of patchy efforts at that, but I think we should be using our international development budget to help those poorer countries on the flyway to protect and restore habitat. And we need to be putting all the diplomatic pressure we can onto the European Union and some of those European countries to ban this hunting. But it's easier said than done. Tony, your career is extraordinary. You were in BirdLife, which is one of the most important pieces of architecture in the whole nature movement worldwide. And then Friends of the Earth, which you ran. Then you went to work with the then Prince of Wales and did a whole bunch of writing and campaigning within his sustainability unit. And then WWF. And then the triumph of all triumphs, Michael Gove appointed you chair of Natural England. And he got a lot of stick from some of the rougher end of the Tory party at the time for doing that, because people know that you're something of a radical. And by radical, it means you recognize the severity of the challenge that we face, and you embrace the enormity of the opportunity to restore nature. So that's quite a dangerous person to have running an organization like Natural England. And so many of us in the movement were very, very excited that when you joined. What I want to talk about is this dream that you and I both have of vibrant ecosystems, the length and breadth of Britain. And of course, Natural England's responsibility is England, but you've got a wider view personally. Now, this idea of blobs of nature, functional nature, imagine from the southwest where I am now, imagine Bodmin restored to a mosaic of Atlantic temperate rainforest, grazed extensively by native cattle, and so sort of mosaic habitat, connected by corridors to Dartmoor, and Dartmoor connected by corridors up through Exmoor, with species like pine martins and wildcats and white storks back in those landscapes. Beavers are already back. And the Exmoor connected with the Somerset Levels and across Selwood Forest, where I'm sitting now, up into the chalk downland of Stonehenge, down to New Forest. You can imagine a country in which we have these blocks of functional, wild, vibrant nature with thriving communities of people living in them, connected by corridors all the way up. So how do we get there? I mean, that is the nature recovery network idea.
It is.
What do we have to do to get there? I know it's a big question, but you are the chair of Natural England. How do we get there?
Okay, Ben. Well, you're painting a picture of a vision that I very much share. And actually, what is remarkable in the 6 and a bit years that I've been at Natural England is the tangible shift in this discussion to the point today where it's not just a few folks like you and I speaking like this. You can actually see things happening on the ground which are beginning to give effect to this kind of idea. And so some of the big regional nature movements that are breaking out, multi-sector partnerships like Big Chalk, which is taking exactly the approach you're thinking about there in relation to the chalk geology of southern England, those beautiful downlands and expanses of grassland, trying to link those up across from Dorset through to Norfolk. These kinds of plans are now being laid by multi-sector partnerships across the north of England. There's Nature North, there's Nature Southwest, operating across Devon, Cornwall, Dorset, Somerset. And so this kind of bringing together of different people, land managers, conservation groups, elements of government. This is beginning to happen. And the really exciting thing is that we have now some tools, practical ones and policy tools, that are beginning to enable us to move into this space, not only in terms of aspiration, but also delivery, and being able to think about how we can work on the ground with multiple actors to be able to get them pointing in the same direction beyond an individual farm, beyond an individual part of a county, and to be thinking in terms of this nature recovery network idea. And this was one of the most exciting thoughts when I came to Natural England that we embedded into our strategy, was to deliver a national nature recovery network. And so what have we got now to be able to do this? So there's a few things that we're doing at Natural England that give me huge excitement noting this increased willingness of people to want to go on this journey. So one is the idea of supranational nature reserves, and we have a series of those that we're declaring at the moment. We did one just between Manchester and Liverpool earlier this week, which is bringing together multiple sites run by multiple people to try and connect them up to create some sense of cohesion and to maximise the benefits that come from those places for the local community, for carbon capture, for flood risk reduction, and of course the recovery of wildlife. So we're doing that through a mechanism that we've been working with at Natural England now for more than 70 years, the National Nature Reserves. And then we have a new policy tool called Landscape Recovery, which is part of our post-Brexit agricultural policy in England, which is bringing landowners, land managers, farmers together at scale across entire catchments in some cases, being able to forge common cause. And at the same time as we've got all of that, we've got in development a new land use framework in England, which has been brought forward by the government, which recognises the need to increase the amount of nature that we have. And so, this is a long-term problem that we're dealing with, recognising that nature's been in decline for centuries. But hopefully it won't take us centuries to recover it. Hopefully we can make some big progress in decades, and hopefully a single decade.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that of all the problems that we face as a society, fixing nature seems to be potentially the least expensive, because nature just has this will to be. We all see the kind of weeds popping up through the gaps in the pavement when we walk outside our homes or our offices. Or if you go to a tropical city, you go to Mumbai and see those amazing Art Deco buildings. Well, sometimes a multi-generational ownership of those buildings leads to disputes and nobody takes responsibility. And very quickly you have fig trees growing out of the upper windows. And nature wants to recover. And so often all we need to do is remove the impediments that we've put before it. So, for example, removing dams and weirs from rivers, or stopping harmful activities such as bottom trawling in the sea, or overgrazing by sheep in the national parks. It's not the huge cost that you have around kind of decarbonising the electricity system or electrifying transport, or fixing some of the major health or other challenges that we face. And I think the biggest reform that's taken place in terms of impact has been the reform of agricultural subsidies following Brexit. I don't know if you remember, but we had a call, you and I, with Craig Bennett and a bunch of others in 2016, before the Brexit referendum, without any inkling of the way that it would ultimately go. And the discussion was around how we might push the European Union to reform its common agriculture policy. And of course, we then had the Brexit vote. Michael Gove then became Secretary of State at DEFRA. And fast forward to today, and we have an environmental land management scheme here in England in its place. And it seems to me the only thing where Remainers and Brexiters all seem to agree, that something good is happening, because those perverse incentives to do the wrong thing with land have gone. Now, I visited a 6,000-acre arable farmer on the Big Chalk in Wiltshire, and because he's no longer subsidised just for existing, he's taking advantage of stewardship payments on approximately 20% of his land to restore downland, the least productive 20% of his land, and he's got a landscape recovery scheme to do a whole rewiggling of the River Wylye that gives Wiltshire its name, where there are already beavers, and a whole kind of 300-acre floodplain reconnection and things. So presumably, this is the biggest change that's taken place in our world, is the reform of agricultural subsidies in England. Yes,
it is. And on that cost point, Ben, I was in the field earlier this week with some of our specialists, and one of our peatland people, the phrase he used was that we can do this, talking of nature recovery, dead cheap, was his point. And, this is not an expensive programme in the greater scheme of things. And we do have some budgets to help, including agriculture. Now, you mentioned that 2016 meeting, and I do recall that. And actually, that came a year after I'd published What Nature Does for Britain, which was a book about all the wonderful things that nature does for the country, not just for wildlife, but for the economy and public health and everything. And I remember writing in there, that we should switch 100% of the farm budget to nature recovery. And here we are 10 years later, and this is exactly what is happening. And so this just shows you, in the space of a decade, we can go from one reality into a completely different one. And I think that should give us all a huge amount of confidence and optimism about what can be done, especially when you couple it with a land use framework whereby you could say that, the country doesn't have enough nature. That's true. Also, we do need to be producing a lot of our own food. And if you put those those two thoughts together and you decide where the least productive land is, where nature could benefit the most, and also at the same time where we could catch and hold a lot of carbon, then you see that, we still have a very large part of the country producing good food for everybody. And if those farmers are supported to go down the regenerative agriculture route, to look after their soils, to look after features in the farmed landscape, including hedges and ponds, then we can bring back wildlife across the wider ecosystem, partly farmed, as well as being able to clean up our rivers, which are not only suffering from sewage pollution, but also from agricultural runoff. So the opportunities are huge if only we take a joined up approach. And actually on joined up approaches, Ben, there's also a lot to be said for how we might invest more in nature-based solutions, because a huge amount of benefit could be gained, for example, in relation to reducing flood risk by restoring wetlands, hillsides on woodlands, putting back the peat bogs in the uplands, which would bring a range of other benefits, and in some catchments is cheaper than investing in concrete and steel defences. So can we find ways of shifting some of these other budgets alongside agriculture into a place whereby we get nature recovery, bringing a range of other very valuable services for the nation? And actually the insurance industry might wish to participate in that project too, because flooding now is becoming an enormously costly problem. And for the insurance industry, in the end, these kinds of impacts are existential for the viability of their business. Can they join with government in funding these kinds of catchment scale nature recovery projects, which we know can be done because we've got examples now of how this can work in practice?
Yeah, the agricultural subsidies pre-2016 under the old Common Agricultural Policy felt to me like a kind of opioid drip, which stifled any kind of innovation and led people to think of land really as about food production and nothing else. And what the removal of those subsidies has done is opened our minds to other possibilities for the land. Henry Dimbleby's brilliant 2021 food strategy report showed that around 80% of the food, or even more, 85%, comes from just 20% of the land, which is mostly in East Anglia, and that the least productive 20% of the land, which is more or less perfectly overlaps with our national parks, produce less than 1% of the food. And so where I'm sitting right now in the Selwood Forest, we've got 5 rivers that rise within 3 miles of here. You've got the Wylye flowing out east, you've got the Stour flowing down into Dorset, you've got the Brew and the Alum flowing out towards the levels in the west, and then you've got Somerset Froom, which becomes the Somerset Avon, flowing northwest. And so millions of people are dependent upon this quite small piece of land known as Selwood Forest, a kind of grade 4, grade 5, heavy clay, terrible for farming, very unproductive, but they're dependent upon it for their fresh water. And also they're affected by it in terms of flooding in the winter and the inevitable hose pipe bans that come if we have a dry summer. And so focusing on this landscape for water makes perfect sense. And we need more nature in the country. We also need more water. We've designed our landscapes to get rid of water as fast as we can. And so restoring nature and having a kind of nature priority in places like Selwood Forest, where I'm sitting now, or Exmoor, or Dartmoor, or Bodmin to my west, makes perfect sense. And the beauty of some of the work that you've done and others in the ecological movement is that we don't need to stop farming. The native cattle perform a keystone role in the ecosystem by grazing and browsing and trampling and their dung. They play the role that they previously played by aurochs and wild bison and so on. So we can still have vibrant farming communities. They'll just be farming much more like their great-great-grandparents farmed, instead of ranching sheep or trying to plough land that is not very good at being ploughed. They'll have extensive native cattle, extensive native pigs and so on in a traditional way.
Indeed. And I think this, Ben, is a very important aspect of what's now needed to accelerate this transition, is about how we spread that thinking in a way which is going to take hold culturally. Because I do think that quite a lot of what we struggle with is not about a lack of science or about a lack of evidence as to the benefits we get from restoring nature. It's because very often we're battling with how things have always been done. And this often is a cultural challenge, in the sense of people will be very used to managing the land in a particular way. Their grandfather or their father did a particular style of farming, and therefore they remain wedded to that. And so how we help people to see the possibilities of a different future in a way which makes sense to them, I think is really a big part of the challenge. And, you and I have both over the years remarked on this culture of tidiness, which is such a huge problem in terms of how we fail to restore nature. People mowing the ground down to bare turf rather than permitting scrubby, wilder swards, how the hedgerows are cut into tight square shapes rather than being allowed to grow out. And then looking at some of the practices linked to, for example, sheep farming, which over the years has become very used to producing as much meat as possible or as many animals as possible, rather than thinking about the long-term viability of that kind of agriculture, and indeed even putting productivity before profit. And some of the really exciting things I've seen over recent years are about shifting farming in ways which make huge sense to farmers. And so, some of the work being done in the uplands whereby people are running fewer sheep of traditional varieties, meaning that they need to spend less money on feed in the winter. The animals need less vet care because they're more adapted to the conditions. And as a result of those kinds of shifts, the farmers are getting pure profit and taking cost out of their business. And this means they need to spend less time working to produce those animals. And this is at the same time bringing nature benefits in terms of the vegetation becoming longer. And so that in some ways is a cultural shift, and moving from productivity and towards profit and working with the grain of nature in a way which is going to bring benefits not only to the environment but also to the farmers. But I do think very often we're kind of struggling with a set of cultural norms, whether it's to do with productivity or to do with tidiness, and how we navigate that particular set of challenges, I think, is less to do with ecology and probably more to do with psychology and how people think about the work that they're doing in the landscape. And that's a big deal. And actually, this also links back to an earlier bit of the conversation and those hunters in Malta and elsewhere. Why do they do that? I think very often they're doing it because it's a sense of tradition, and people have always done this, and therefore we're always going to do it. And shifting from that reality to a new reality where the birds are seen as a beautiful asset for the island, which is part of a wider international responsibility of Malta to look after migratory birds, that's a different mindset. And so how we get from one mindset to another, I think, is a really, really important part of the future progress we will make. And I think, therefore, inviting more input to this thinking from social psychologists and behavioural psychologists, as well as people who know about birds and insects and grasslands.
Yeah, I had Brett Jenks from the organisation Rare on this podcast, and his organisation grew out of a campaign to save a St. Lucian endemic parrot.
I know it from my bird life days.
Exactly. Well, the parrot was down to its last few individuals, and they said what we need here is a paradigm shift in behaviour. Right? We need a cultural shift. Yeah. We need the St. Lucian people to value this parrot as their unique parrot, their thing, and it worked. And now that Rare has become a global organization, and it's applying that idea to small scale fisheries and reefs and all kinds of ecosystems around the world. And I think we are undergoing a parallel economic and cultural shift around nature. Now, you see it in the papers and in magazines and on social media and in the kinds of books that are stacked up at the entrance at Waterstones. People are yearning for greater connection with nature, and there is this shift towards embracing mess and embracing more self-willed nature in our lives. You've had the Rewilding London Task Force and other cities following suit. And I think the last people for that cultural shift to reach are those who are frightened about what seem like very dramatic, quite scary changes taking place in their landscapes. Yeah. The communities that have lived in remote landscapes for generations and have farmed in a particular way, they feel under pressure, especially with their subsidies now withdrawn. It's a time of great change. So I agree with you. The economic shift has to go hand in hand with a cultural shift, and some very careful and sensitive messaging needs to come from the nature movement. Do you think, Tony, that the government and its agencies, including Natural England, are keeping up with the shifts that we've been discussing? For example, those who are involved in species reintroductions in the UK, those involved with the return of beavers, for example, might suggest that the government and Natural England in particular are still of a kind of older, more cautious mindset, and that they haven't yet embraced the kind of ambition that you find in places like Kazakhstan, where they're tipping thousands of saiga antelope and wild ass out of the backs of trucks into vast grassland landscapes, and they're looking to bring back cheetahs and so on. And the species reintroductions taking place around the world, the Spanish with their lynx recovery have been, have performed miracles. In the year 2000, there were maybe 60 or 90 lynx left. Now there's 3,000, and that was all through captive breeding and species reintroduction. So do you think the government's keeping up? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
Government is a complex business, of course, and, the realm of policy making and passing laws, it often is in a different zone compared to, the practical possibilities or what the science tells us. And so this is a constantly shifting context as well. And so we just had a change of government from several Conservative governments, one of which I think was very ambitious on the nature recovery and reintroduction agenda led by Boris Johnson. And then that changed with subsequent prime ministers who were very much less keen on that. And now we're with a new government of a different colour, which is, I think, giving some very positive signals about its appetite for this kind of thing. And it's very interesting, actually, that when I came to Natural England in 2019, I thought, we're very close now to getting a decision on beaver reintroduction in England. It took 6 more years, however, including a change of government, to the point where we got this over the line in February 2025 under a new Labour government. So the politics and who's in charge, not only which political party, but also which politician, it does shape this really quite profoundly. At the moment, I do feel as though we're in a better place, although, the public debate, which shapes the politics, is always going to be important, irrespective of who the Secretary of State for the Environment or Prime Minister is. And, you may have seen some remarks I made a few weeks ago, which got printed in The Guardian about my enthusiasm for lynx reintroduction in England. A huge chorus of opposition and pushback on that, much of it utterly uninformed, but reflecting fears and the resistance to change and the, citing of all sorts of consequences that could follow, much of which was unfounded. But nonetheless, it is a set of real reactions which will be noted by politicians as making the subject complicated and therefore needing some caution. And so the fact that we live in this divided, contested country still when it comes to some of this, I think, does cause the politics to go more slowly. And this, Ben, is also, I think, in some large part, a reflection of a crowded country. Pretty much every square metre here has got at least one or multiple kinds of, pressures on it, from farming, from house building, from solar panels, from reservoirs, from roads, all of these different things crowding into the landscape, and then adding in the idea that we might wish to have some apex predators back. Sometimes it can spark a reaction which you wouldn't get in places like Kazakhstan, where you've got a lot more space and, a different politics as well, of course, in terms of how their country works compared with ours. But we do our very best at Natural England to make the case for high ambition when it comes to things like species reintroduction. And I'm hopeful that the new government will, really take this on and see the opportunities that we have to really lead in a crowded country. And actually, leading in a crowded country is more important than leadership coming from a country that's sparsely populated. And we know we have a global emergency, and ministers were out this week saying that the UK should show leadership on climate and nature. And we heard that from Ed Miliband and Steve Reed. And that sentiment of us showing leadership at a time of these global pressures becoming very apparent, I do hope will be reflected in, questions like the return of golden eagle, the return of lynx to England being on the agenda in a way which we haven't seen for a while, or indeed ever, actually, in terms of those two species.
Yeah, and in spite of all the political and cultural difficulties, we're in a whole different world here in Britain as compared with where we might have been. If you consider how we felt about things 15 years ago, who'd have believed 15 years ago that we'd have free-living beavers now across a whole number of river catchments in the UK, that we'd have wildcats being reintroduced in a bunch of different places, white storks, white-tailed eagles on the Solent. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening, and I think lots of reasons for optimism.
There is.
Of course, you worked with the then Prince of Wales in writing his iconic book, Harmony, I guess 15 or so years ago. That book had a huge impact on me, Tony, when I read it. It highlights the great disconnection of people from nature, tracing back the disconnection to the time of the Enlightenment, and describing how we might bring ourselves closer to nature and learn to live in harmony with the natural world once again. I think that might be one of the most important things out of many that you've done. Now, what for you is the most significant good news story of current times?
I think probably the biggest single thing is what we were discussing a moment ago, was the shift in the agricultural policy, which is being coupled with a grassroots movement of farmers who now are moving into thinking about agriculture differently. And I do feel as though, we are on the edge now of a big series of changes that over the coming years I think will lead to us looking back on this period maybe from the 2050s and thinking actually that was the turning point. It does feel like that. It's sometimes hard to appreciate in the day-to-day as you look at specific cases of a bit of wetland being drained in order to make way for a road or something, or pressures from house building, but I do think the fundamentals are shifting, and if the fundamentals shift then the outcomes can shift.
What would your biggest ask be? If you could wave a magic wand and some legislative or regulatory change were to occur in this country, or some shift of some sort that could advance this thing even more, what would it be?
Well, if you look back at the laws that we operate at Natural England, they were passed in the late 1940s. They've been adapted since, and they've been added to by subsequent European legislation, which we still have some of. I think what we need now is a new landmark Act of Parliament to set the vision for the coming 50 to 100 years. And I would have a law called Nature Recovery in a Changing Climate, which would be about exactly the vision that you set out at the beginning, Ben, the Nature Recovery Network, linking up landscapes across the country, truly visionary in restoring nature at scale, but doing that in a way which is going to help the country to thrive in terms of public health, our resilience to climate change, and to be able to secure our water and food security long into the future, because those things are not separate from nature. We depend upon nature for those things. Water held in the land will help us to cope with drought into the future. Pollinating insects, healthy soils, fresh water availability, of course, is vital for food security. So a visionary piece of legislation coming from the new government called Nature Recovery in a Changing Climate, I think that would be the kind of thing that would be fit for our times. And I do hope that we can convince ministers to take that kind of step.
Yeah, there was talk of a nature bill when Michael Gove was still at DEFRA, and I couldn't agree more. Well, let's make it happen, Tony. I so enjoy speaking to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this podcast. Thank God you're at Natural England.
Well, thank you, Ben, for all the leadership you show, because you're an absolute dynamo, convincing more and more people to think about these things in the way that we need. So between us, hopefully, and a few other friends and colleagues, we're making the difference needed.
I was at DEFRA for a bunch of years from 2018, during which time there were conversations about a nature law, but ultimately there wasn't enough parliamentary time and the idea fizzled. But Tony Juniper's still there as chair of Natural England, and we've got a new government that seems to be taking nature restoration seriously. So I think this idea has legs, and I'm very excited about it. And I'm so happy to have had Tony on the podcast. He's one of the great heroes for nature in Britain today. If you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed making it, please do give us a like or a review on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts, and keep spreading the word. Numbers are growing the whole time, and that's thanks to you. On the next episode, I'm going to be talking about the giant land tortoises of the islands of the Indian Ocean with Selina Chien, who works with the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance. Selina and others are carefully reintroducing these extraordinary giant tortoises to the islands from which they were extirpated by Europeans 1, 2, even 300 years ago.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.